51 years. That is how long Laura Ann Aime waited. Not for suspicion, there had always been suspicion. Not for a confession had already been given. She waited for proof. Back in 1989, just before his execution in Florida, Ted Bundy told investigators he was responsible for Laura's death. But he gave no details, no specifics, nothing that could stand up in court. So Utah authorities did something few understood at the time. They refused to close the case. They preserved the evidence and waited. Decades went by. Then, in 2026, the cold case everyone thought was solved turned out to be the one that had never been proven. Until a DNA database match, powered by genetic genealogy technology that did not exist in Laura's lifetime, delivered what decades of investigation could not. The case is now closed. Laura Ann Aime was born on August 21, 1957 in Lehi, Utah. She was the second of 7 children of James Jr. Aime and Shirlene Tolton Aime. Being the second oldest in a big family means you are old enough to be responsible, but still young enough to be figuring out who you are. You are always surrounded by people who need you. For Laura, this role seemed to fit her well. She embraced it. The family raised their children on a farm in Fairview, a small town in Sanpete County in central Utah. The Wasatch Plateau rises to the east, and the valley floor stretches out flat and wide below. It is the kind of place where children grow up learning the land, its seasons, its animals, its rhythms. Laura knew all of it. She was tall, and other kids sometimes teased her for it, but she moved with the confidence that comes from spending time outdoors. She did not worry about her appearance or how much space she took up. Laura loved animals, especially horses. She was not just interested, she was devoted, like some teenagers who let one passion shape their lives. She joined an all-girls riding club called the Silver Spurs. Her sister Michelle remembered a detail that has stayed with people for decades. Laura fed her horse red licorice nibs. Not carrots or regular feed, but red licorice nibs. This small, specific detail reminds us that Laura was a real person, living a real life, with habits and a personality unique enough to be remembered 50 years later. Laura also played softball. She went to North Sanpete High School, where people remembered her for her free-spirited energy that could make any classroom feel smaller. She and her sister Michelle were very close. They shared a bedroom on the family farm, as siblings often do when there are 7 children and limited space. Michelle later said Laura took her everywhere, not because she had to, but because that was just who she was. Several family members remembered Laura spending her own money she earned herself, to buy candy for her younger siblings. She did it not for any special reason, but simply because seeing them smile meant more to her than keeping the money. She had an older brother named John and 4 younger sisters, Evelyn, Michelle, Denna, and Tommy Lynn. Everyone who knew her said she understood what it meant to be part of something bigger than herself. At 17, in the fall of 1974, she was just starting to figure out who she wanted to be. She looked beyond the farm, beyond Fairview, and beyond everything she already loved. In the fall of 1974, Utah still felt safe, like many small communities do, at least until something happens to change that feeling. Laura lived in Utah County and was part of the social world that teenagers created at that time. Parties, friends, and last-minute plans. People gave and accepted rides without thinking twice. Hitchhiking was common and unremarkable. Trust was normal for her generation. No one imagined that a law student at the University of Utah could be spending his evenings targeting young women across the Wasatch Front. By that October, Ted Bundy had already been killing for months. In Washington state, women had been disappearing from campuses, parks, and even in broad daylight. Utah did not know this yet. The name Ted Bundy meant nothing to anyone in Sanpete County. On October 31, 1974, Laura Aime got ready for a Halloween party, unaware of any danger. The night and the party started out ordinary until everything changed. By October 1974, Ted Bundy had been in Utah for about a month. He had enrolled at the University of Utah College of Law that fall.
He drove, dodging traffic, leaving behind a state where women had been disappearing from parks, campuses, and roadsides all summer. Investigators in Washington were still trying to figure out what was happening. They would later realize they had been dealing with a predator who, by that October, had already committed multiple murders. Bundy had developed a method that was disturbingly refined. He did not operate impulsively. He scouted, he positioned. He understood that the most effective way to take a young woman was to approach her in the gap.
The transitional moment between one safe place and the next. Walking to a car, leaving a party, and running a quick errand. These were moments when someone was in motion, but not yet arrived. Their guard was lowest because they were almost somewhere safe. People who knew or met him in everyday situations described him as completely unremarkable. Dangerous people often are. He was articulate, studying law, and had a social life and routine. On the surface, he seemed like an ambitious young professional. That image was his weapon, and he knew how to use it. Laura was reportedly leaving the Halloween party in Lehi to walk to a nearby convenience store. It was the kind of short errand that would take 10 minutes on any other night. That brief, unaccompanied walk on a dark October evening was the kind of opportunity Bundy had taken advantage of many times in 2 states. Investigators have never been able to say for sure whether Bundy was there by chance and saw Laura walking alone, or if he had planned to be near party locations that night. They were able to determine that what happened to Laura matched Bundy's actions with other women in Utah and Colorado in the following months. The way he approached, abducted, restrained, and left victims in remote places all fit a pattern. That pattern only became clear in hindsight, after more victims and crime scenes, and after investigators in different states started sharing information. Only then did they realize they were dealing with the same killer. But that understanding came too late to protect
Laura Aime
on Halloween night. She left the party to run an errand and never returned. When Laura did not come home on Halloween night, her family reported her missing. In another time or situation, a teenager staying out late on Halloween might not have caused immediate concern. But Laura's family knew something was wrong. Days went by, then weeks. There were no calls, no sightings, and no word from anyone who had seen her after she left the party. The silence was complete, and it became more painful as time passed. For 28 days, Laura Aime was nowhere to be found. She was not at home, not with friends, and not in any hospital, shelter, or holding cell. She was simply gone, as if the night itself had taken her away. Then, hikers found her. On November 27, 1974, 28 days after Laura disappeared, hikers were walking near American Fork Canyon Road, also known as State Road 92. They saw something partway down an embankment in the Wasatch Mountains. It was Laura. Authorities said she was found bound, severely beaten, and unclothed. A nylon stocking had been used in the killing. The condition of her body in the remote Canyon Road location told investigators 2 things right away. This was not a random crime gone wrong. It was planned. Whoever did this went to great lengths to hide her body. The fact that she was found at all was due to chance. The hikers were on a trail they might not have chosen on any other day. Without their discovery, Laura might have remained missing forever. She could have become just another name that disappears from the record, with no body, no answers, and no closure. But she was found. From late 1974 on, the investigation continued for 5 decades, lasting more than 37 years after the man who killed her died. Investigators believe the way Laura died pointed to a killer who was experienced, organized, and methodical. The binding, use of a nylon stocking, removal of clothing, and the remote location all suggested someone who had done this before and knew how to control both the victim and the crime scene. Laura suffered severe abuse. Authorities documented injuries that showed a long, violent assault, one that suggested not just rage, but control. The official reports were restrained, as they have been throughout this case, but the evidence spoke for itself. Earlier investigations found a detail that made the case even more disturbing.
Laura's body may have been placed near American Fort Canyon only shortly before it was found on November 27th. If true, this means she may have been kept alive for some time after her disappearance on October 31st, possibly for days. This possibility matched what investigators later saw in Bundy's other cases, where victims were sometimes held and abused over time. What investigators could not do in 1974, with the tools they had, was link the physical evidence to a specific person. DNA profiling and genetic databases did not exist yet. The science that would later solve this case had not been invented. This limitation defined the cold case for the next 50 years. What makes Laura's story so powerful is not just the crime, but who she was in the months before it happened, and how that part of her life has sometimes been misunderstood. By the fall of 1974, Laura had reportedly moved away from school
and toward a more independent, countercultural lifestyle. She spent time with older friends and socialized outside the usual routines of a small Utah town. Some say she started hitchhiking more often. In the 1970s, this was normal for a teenager wanting more freedom. Looking back, it put her in the kind of vulnerable situation that someone like Bundy could exploit. But none of that made her careless or responsible for what happened. Laura was a 17-year-old girl, the second of 7 children, raised on a farm, close to her siblings, and known for her generosity and warmth. She was doing what teenagers do, pushing boundaries, testing her independence, and trying to find her place. That is not a risk factor. That is just being 17. The tragedy is that in 1974, no one realized the most dangerous person in Utah was the one who seemed the most trustworthy. From the beginning, investigators had reason to look at Ted Bundy. The method of killing bore the hallmarks of what authorities were only beginning, to recognize as a pattern across the Pacific Northwest and the Mountain West. Bundy was living in Salt Lake City. He was attending the University of Utah College of Law, just 40 minutes from where Laura's body was found. He was in the area. The timeline fits. The methods aligned. But suspicion is not evidence. And in 1974, the forensic science that could have converted suspicion into certainty simply did not exist. The investigation in Utah began yielding results on a parallel track through a different case. In November 1974, the same month Laura's body was discovered, Bundy attempted to abduct an 18-year-old named Carol Duranch from a shopping mall in Murray, Utah, posing as a police officer. Duranch managed to escape from his car after he attempted to handcuff her and strike her with a crowbar. Her account gave investigators their first living witness to Bundy's approach method. In August 1975, a Utah Highway Patrol officer stopped Bundy near a Salt Lake City suburb after observing him driving erratically late at night. The search of his car turned up handcuffs, rope, a ski mask, and other items associated with abduction. He was arrested. Bundy was convicted in Utah for the aggravated kidnapping of Carol Duranch in March 1976 and sentenced to 15 years in the Utah State Prison. He was subsequently extradited to Colorado to face charges in the murder of Karen Campbell, a young woman killed at a ski resort in January 1975. He escaped from a Colorado courthouse law library in June 1977, was recaptured, and escaped again from the Garfield County Jail in December of that year. He fled to Florida. On January 15, 1978, he attacked 4 women at the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University, killing 2 of them. Weeks later, he abducted and murdered 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. He was arrested for the last time on February 15, 1978, in Pensacola, Florida. He was convicted of the Chi Omega murders and the Kimberly Leach murder, sentenced to death on 3 counts, and executed by electric chair on January 24, 1989. In the days and hours before his execution, Bundy engaged in a series of confessions, tactical, calculated, offered as bargaining chips in a last-ditch effort to delay his death. He acknowledged his culpability in Laura Aime's murder, but he provided no specifics. No description of what happened after he took her. No details about where she was held or for how long.
nothing that could stand independently as corroboration. Utah investigators faced a dilemma that has no clean resolution. Closing the case on Bundy's verbal admission would have been the path of least resistance. It would have given the public a clean ending, but it would also have been legally and investigatively incomplete, particularly because, at the time, other leads in Laura Aime's case had not been fully resolved. Investigators were not prepared to say definitively that Bundy, and only Bundy, was responsible, not without physical evidence to confirm it. So they made the harder choice. They kept the case open, they preserved the evidence, and they waited for the tools that would eventually make the difference. This is the part of the story that most people think they already know. Ted Bundy confessed. Case closed. But the investigators who spent decades on this file knew something the public didn't. A confession without proof is just a statement. And a case closed on a statement alone is a case that can be reopened by anyone willing to challenge it. What comes next is how science finally finished what Bundy's words never could. Cold cases survive because someone refuses to let them die. In Laura's case, it was not one person, it was a system. The Utah County Sheriff's Office maintained the case file across generations of investigators. Evidence was preserved with a care that went beyond standard procedure.
It was an act of institutional faith, faith that someday the technology would exist to do what human intuition alone could not. That faith was not blind. Cold case units across the country have learned, often painfully, that preserved evidence is the single most important factor in whether an old case can ever be resolved. DNA degrades, samples contaminate, chain of custody breaks, labels fade, storage conditions shift. Any one of those failures can render 50 years of patience meaningless. But in Laura's case, the evidence survived, intact enough, clean enough, and properly documented enough to be retested decades later with tools that her original investigators could not have imagined. The detectives who kept this case alive did not know when the breakthrough would come. They did not know if it would come. They only knew that if they let the evidence go, it never would. That decision, to preserve, to wait, to refuse the easy closure of a self-incriminating statement, is what made everything that followed possible. The breakthrough came from a convergence of patience, preservation, and technology, all three of which had to be in place simultaneously for this to work. If the evidence had degraded, none of the technology would have mattered. If the technology hadn't advanced far enough, the evidence would still be sitting in storage. If the investigators hadn't preserved the case file with the discipline they did, there would have been nothing left to test. All three held. And in 2023, they came together. That year, the Utah Crime Lab obtained new DNA extraction technology, equipment specifically engineered to pull viable genetic profiles from biological samples that were small, degraded, or mixed with contaminating material. In practical terms, this means samples where the DNA strands have broken down over decades, where the original genetic material has partially deteriorated, and where older methods would have returned either nothing usable or a result too incomplete to upload to any database. This new technology works at a finer level of resolution. It can recover genetic information from fragments that earlier systems couldn't process. Investigators returned to the preserved physical evidence from Laura's case, collected in 1974 and stored through more than 50 years of changing administrations, changing protocols, and changing technology. Using the new extraction process, analysts were able to identify and isolate a single male DNA profile from the biological evidence. One profile, clean enough, complete enough, specific enough to be usable. That profile was entered into a national law enforcement DNA database, the kind of centralized genetic genealogy infrastructure that has become the backbone of modern cold case investigation. When a DNA profile is uploaded to these systems, it is cross-referenced against reference profiles maintained by law enforcement agencies across the country. Profiles collected from convicted offenders, from crime scenes, from individuals who have consented to inclusion. If there is a match, the system flags it and notifies the relevant agencies. In this case, the system flagged a match almost immediately.
because the profile it was comparing against was not an unknown suspect. It was a known one. In March 2026, Florida authorities, who had maintained a genetic reference profile for Theodore Robert Bundy since his years on death row before his 1989 execution, notified the Utah County Sheriff's Office that the DNA extracted from Laura Aime's case evidence matched Bundy's profile. The comparison was not probabilistic. It was not a familial match requiring additional genealogy work to trace down a suspect. It was a direct hit. The extracted profile from a 51-year-old evidence sample matched precisely to a documented genetic reference belonging to one of the most extensively documented criminals in American history. There was no ambiguity, no partial match, no confidence interval expressed in percentages. The DNA from Laura Aime's evidence was Bundy's DNA. 51 years after Laura disappeared on Halloween night, science delivered what confession alone never could. Not a statement, not an admission made by a man hoping to trade time for truth. Physical proof, the kind that doesn't negotiate, doesn't recant, and doesn't depend on the integrity of the person who provided it. On April 1st, 2026, the Utah County Sheriff's Office held a press conference. Sheriff Mike Smith stood at the podium and said what Laura's family had waited more than half a century to hear. They could now say, without a doubt, that Ted Bundy murdered Laura Aime. The case was officially closed. Bundy's connection to Laura's death had been suspected for decades and self-reported by Bundy himself before his execution. But this was the first time it was confirmed with physical evidence.
The first time the forensic standard had been met. The difference matters. Suspicion lives in the gray. A confession without corroboration lives in the gray. DNA does not. Officials also announced something with implications far beyond this single case. The newly developed DNA profile could potentially assist other law enforcement agencies investigating additional unsolved cases linked to Bundy across multiple states. Bundy is believed to have murdered at least 30 women, and some investigators suspect the number could be significantly higher. Laura's case may have been the first to close because of this recovered profile. It may not be the last. At the press conference on April 1st, 2026, Laura's sister, Michelle Impala, stood at the podium and spoke about the sister she had lost 51 years ago. She described Laura as someone who took her everywhere, not as a burden, not out of any sense of duty, but because that was the kind of person Laura was. The kind who made you feel included by default, the kind whose instinct was always to bring people along rather than leave them behind. Michelle spoke about the bedroom they shared on the Fairview farm, about the horses, about a sister who spent her own money on candy for her younger siblings because the act of watching them smile meant more to her than whatever she might have kept for herself. These are the details that survive 5 decades, not the headlines, not the case file summaries, not the documentary reconstructions. The red licorice, the shared bedroom, the instinct to include. Michelle's sister, Tommy Aime, was also there. 2 women in their 60s, one of them approaching 70, standing in a conference room in Utah, surrounded by cameras and microphones and officials, hearing the words they had been waiting more than half a century to hear, stated as fact rather than suspicion. The family remembers Laura as a vibrant teen with a love for horses and the outdoors. What it represents, if you unpack it, is a family that has been carrying a specific, detailed memory of a specific person for 51 years. Not a victim, not a case number, but a sister. For the Aime family, this was not entirely new information. They had lived with the near certainty of Bundy's involvement for decades. They had watched him be convicted of other murders. They had watched him be executed. They had read accounts of his verbal acknowledgement of Laura's death. They knew, in the way that families often know things before the official record catches up. What changed on April 1st, 2026, was the nature of that knowledge. It moved from belief to fact, from suspicion to science, from "we always knew" to "now the record says so too." That shift may sound abstract to someone who has never had to live without it. For a family that spent 51 years in the space between knowing and proving, that shift was not abstract at all. It was the entire distance between a wound that never fully closed and one that finally, formally, could begin to.
Laura Anne
Was born on August 21, 1957, the second of 7 children, a girl who loved horses and animals and the wide open spaces of rural Utah. She disappeared on Halloween night in 1974, and for 51 years, the proof of who killed her sat locked inside evidence that the world was not yet capable of reading. The science caught up, the evidence held, the case closed. But Laura is not a case number. She is a name that belongs to a person who deserved a life she did not get to live. And the fact that it took half a century to confirm what happened to her is not a triumph of technology alone. It is a reminder that justice, when it comes late, arrives carrying the full weight of everything it costs to wait. Cold cases stay cold unless someone investigates. This one refused to stay buried. If this case stayed with you and you believe 51 years is too long for a family to wait, but the wait was worth it because someone preserved the evidence and refused to close the file, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We really appreciate your support. We revisit the cold cases the system left behind, unsolved murders, missing persons cases, and forensic breakthroughs, finally bringing answers. With your encouragement, we will keep going back for them.